I'm totally thrilled to be able to introduce this particular piece to you, In the Mists by Leos Janacek. Why? Well, for me, Janacek is absolutely desert island stuff. I know it's an overused phrase, but I think his music is nothing short of genius. He's for sure less heralded than early 20th century counterparts such as Bartok or Stravinsky, but for my money, every bit as revolutionary and radical. Why do I love his music? Well, it speaks, I think, with this almost alarming directness, this sense of relevance and immediacy. He has this totally beguiling way to fuse the vernacular, the folk forms, the song and the dance with something ultra modern and completely uncompromising. So if it's uncompromising, what's our way in going to be? Well, I think with Janacek, one really interesting way in is through his biography. And this is not something I necessarily feel is the case with every composer and every piece. But with Janacek, if we can get some kind of sense of what his state of mind might have been at the time of writing, of course we can never know, but what it might have been, then I think that could give us real concrete insights into the notes on the page. This piece was published in 1912, and in 1912 Janacek was not in a good place. Less than a decade previously, he'd lost his daughter, Olga. She died at the age of only 20, and Janacek was absolutely distraught, of course. But as well as this personal devastation, he was also in a place of professional despair. He's not a young man at this time. In fact, he's well into his middle age, and yet his music is really going nowhere in a sense. He has no audience to speak of. He has some kind of provincial reputation in Moravia, but he can't find any kind of audience or acclaim really, even in Prague, which would be the nearest major musical hub. So I think there's this sense of where's the music going for him? This labour of love that's occupied his entire life, and it's just not being listened to. So that's the context for this piece. And when we consider that, I think the title is particularly interesting because these fogs, for me, are probably more psychological fogs, the mists of his inner turmoil. And I think as this piece plays out, what we're going to be looking to do is to tease out from the notes on the page these elements of volatility almost, which characterize the music. It's very taut, nothing is wasted, and it's packed full of feeling. The opening creates something of, maybe even we could say, a false sense of security. That left-hand figuration, it's almost like some kind of berceuse. It wants to have a real lilt, and we want real suppleness and control to it. Now, that stretch between the A flat at the bottom and the D flat, or in bar 3, the G flat and the D flat, is quite a large one. So we want really to have a sense of rotation here, just so that those gaps between the notes somehow feel smaller. On top of that, cantando dolcissimo, we want the melody to have the most unbelievably true legato we can find. So we want to have a real awareness of that idea of binding the notes together. Now, as I say, it's some kind of calm before the storm, perhaps. So where does the volatility first arrive? Well, I think if we look at bar 19, we can see it. We have this accelerando and the bass line plunges downwards. Before, at the end of the line, we have this sudden ritardando and then the first compositional masterstroke. It's a tiny detail, but we don't want to ignore it. That's the cutoff sign that we see at the end of bar 25. The music suddenly suspends there. And I say it's a masterstroke because somehow, to my ears at least, retrospectively, this colours what we've just heard. It's even darker than we initially thought. And that idea of a berceuse is tragic somehow now. We turn the page and the next iteration of the opening material is now even darker. And don't ignore that we're deep in the neighbourhood of the flat keys here. It's written in D flat major, but really the music at this point is closer to D flat minor. So it's very sombre, very mysterious. It's a very distant key. Janacek thrives on contrast. And so when we get to this middle section, what are we dealing with? Well, this material has a clear folk element to it. And remember, Janacek, like Kodai, like Bartok, was passionate about the folk music he heard around him, and he collected it, he transcribed it. Interestingly too, he transcribed the sounds of nature. He was also obsessed with birdsong, with the sound of frogs even. You can hear the frogs at the end of The Cunning Little Vixen, for example. Back to this though. This folk song is a polka, and the polka was extremely popular in Czech folk music at this time. If we want to hear some polkas translated into the classical idiom elsewhere, check out the piano music of Smetana. He wrote some fantastic polkas for solo piano. And there's also a great operatic realization of a polka in The Bartered Bride, his great opera. So, the tempo here, poco mosso, Janacek suggests crotchet 133, and we need to make sure that whatever tempo we take, this piece has the sense of dance. So I might be asking my student to turn to bar 73, the major iteration of the melody, and to play it through, just the melody, and to make sure that we had a tempo such that when we reached bar 79 with that crotchet rest at the start, we feel that stomp or the jump or the skip, whatever it is, of the dance. Because if this feels like a dance, then we get that magical contrast, which is going to set off, again, the volatility behind this music. The joyousness, the communality, if you like, of folk music is set off against these darker elements. And the dark makes the light lighter, the light makes the dark darker. Where do we see this volatility in this middle section? Look at bar 57. The marking there, triple P. Even in the early 20th century, this is pretty extreme. This is fairly unusual. And yet, within the space of less than a line of music, bar 62, we've got 3 Fs, forte fortissimo. It's an extreme, dramatic move. And Janacek's not finished. We have the 3 Fs. What's next? 2 Fs, bar 64, bar 67, fortissimo again, bar 71, fortissimo espressivo. Over the page, 73, sempre fortissimo espressivo. Bar 81, sforzando fortissimo. This is music of extremes. But Janacek is a parsimonious composer. He never wrote a single gesture that he didn't mean. He never says something twice if once will do. So, as well as introducing our students to a world of emotional tumultuousness in interpretation here, if you like, we can also use this piece to introduce them to this idea of textual fidelity. As I say, he doesn't write anything that he doesn't mean. And one of the miracles of this piece is that all of this turmoil jumps off the page if you just follow what he's written in there in terms of the dynamics, the directions, and so forth. Another subtle example would be great to discuss this. Bar 52, leggero e veloce, when we first get this cascading figure hocketed between those 2 sets of 3 notes. Leggero e veloce. Now, that is the more minor key incarnation of that motif with the F flats there. At the end of the piece, bar 111, we get the major key incarnation of that material as we reach more of a sense of repose or consolation in D flat major. But this time, it's dolcissimo non veloce. So how are we going to make this material sound leggero e veloce first time, but dolcissimo non veloce the second time? What a fascinating conversation that is about interpretation. Now, as always with interpretation questions, it's going to be vital to listen around. What have people in the past done with this material? And in the recorded legacy with Janacek, we have gold dust in the form of the recordings of the great Czech pianist Rudolf Fikuzny. Why do I say this? Well, Fikuzny was Janacek's last pupil, so we have the opportunity to listen to a master pianist play this music, and a master pianist who learnt it from the composer himself. My real hope is that somebody is going to play this music and then take the deep dive into the incredible universe of Janacek's music. His story has something of a happy ending. In the second decade of the 20th century, he suddenly got that little bit of acclaim that he'd always sought. And in a very human touch, just that little bit of adulation sets him going. And in his last slightly over decade, he writes masterpiece after masterpiece after masterpiece. The Sinfonietta, the Glagolitic Mass, some of the greatest operas ever written. It's totally remarkable. A complete tangent to finish with. A student who can play this repertoire may well be looking for something else, just slightly off the beaten track. And in the early 20th century, there's another great piece of music with a very similar title to this. It's called In a Mist, and it's by the American cornet player Bix Beiderbecke, a great jazz musician, an iconic figure in that idiom. And he was also fascinated by early 20th century music. And if you want a really great short piece which fuses the jazz idiom with whole tone scales, all sorts of adventurousness, Bix Beiderbecke's In a Mist, it could even program quite interestingly with this particular piece.